So I'm going to take you on a journey. The title of it is, You Mean I'm Not Going to Live Forever? Obviously, it's a facetious title. You all know you're not going to live forever. There's only one way into this life and one way out. But paradoxically, we all have that knowledge, but we live our lives as if it's not true. As if we've got all the time in the world to do frivolous things, to worry and ruminate, and not valuing the preciousness of the moments in our lives. Well, sometimes being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness is an opportunity to re-examine that belief in the way that we live our lives and the way we prioritize things. So I'm going to take you on a journey here through a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness. And it begins in the dark clouds, the underbelly of the clouds, and hopefully we'll find a way to transform that and to travel through to the vast blue sky and the sun beyond. So let's see how that works. All right, first comes the diagnosis. You hear those words. Now, I should tell you, actually, before I get into this, my background in the area. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm also a professor in the Department of Oncology, and so I sort of do both worlds of research and practice. So I've been working with cancer patients for the last 15 years or so, and as part of my research, I develop interventions to help cope with some of the difficulties that our patients tell us about. So when you get the diagnosis, and it's not just cancer, it can be any life-threatening or chronic illness. You hear those three words. You have heart disease, you have diabetes, you have multiple sclerosis, your family member has ALS, you're dealing with dementia. Many of you have probably, unfortunately, heard those words. Well, what is the first thing that happens? Fear, terror. All of a sudden, that academic, intellectual understanding you have that your life will end in death becomes very real. And it becomes very close. And it's terrifying. It can be very terrifying for people because all of a sudden, they have to deal with that reality that, wow, my life might be over way sooner than I thought. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know what the process might be. I don't know how much pain I might experience. I don't know how I'm going to die. This can be paralyzing to people in many cases, just that fear of death knocking on the door. And you hear so many times from people, after I heard those first three words, I didn't hear another thing. So there's that fear, having to deal with the reality of death, the existential issues. There is uncertainty. You thought your life was going to go a certain way. You thought you'd work, you'd have kids, you'd retire, you'd enjoy a blissful retirement. Well, maybe not. All of a sudden now you have no idea what the rest of your life is going to look like. You don't even know what tomorrow is going to look like. You don't know what your prognosis is. You might not even know exactly what your illness is, how severe it is, what kind of treatment you're going to have. And the doctors aren't always a lot of help. We don't know. We can give you statistics, 5-year survival rates. It's not helpful. So you're confused, you're disoriented, you're perplexed. And there's a loss of control. Again, we mostly live under the illusion that we have control over the course of our lives. Well, I hate to tell you this, but it is an illusion, largely. But having this sort of diagnosis makes you realize, to see that more clearly for the first time, that, wow, I did everything right. You know, a lot of times people did do everything right. They ate well, they exercised, they still got sick. So now what? My life isn't in my hands anymore. I turn myself over to the medical profession. I do what they say when they say. I get these treatments. I've lost that sense of being the master of my own destiny. So all of these elements of the cancer experience lead to what we call a roller coaster ride of emotions. You're up one day, you're down the next day, you get good news, you get a good scan, you get a bad scan. It's this constant up and down. So then we psychologists like to talk about coping and ways of coping. So we tend to break it down into two major groups, problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. So we're pretty good in the West. We're educated, we're skilled at knowing how to solve problems. So we usually shift right into the problem-focused mode. We gather all the information, we get the right diagnosis, we look at the research, what kind of trials or interventions are going to be helpful, we make a treatment plan, and we do all this. And then we launch into the treatment phase. And that can take, it can include surgery, adjuvant treatments of various types of medications or chemotherapies or radiation therapy. This can take a matter of weeks, months, even years. So we're so focused on getting the job done, solving the problem, a lot of times we don't really encounter the emotional impact until later. But eventually the emotions come, and they can be completely overwhelming. So for example, if we haven't had a chance to deal with them, common emotions are depression, anger, anxiety, stress. And unfortunately, we're not as well trained in emotion-focused coping as we are in problem solving. So a lot of times we don't know what to do with these emotions. Maybe if I just stuff it down, it'll go away. I'll just pretend it doesn't exist. I'll just put on a happy face and be positive and everything will be fine. Well, the psychologists in the crowd and all of the different clinicians, we know that doesn't work. So what do we do with those emotions? Well, what we do know is that the best way to allow them to run their course is to not resist, just to let go, to let be. Accept that this is what is. You might not like that you have cancer. Nobody likes this situation. Nobody likes feeling this way, but if it is, it is. It's much easier to accept it and let it run its course than to try and stuff it away and pretend it's not there. So to take that to an extreme, you just surrender. Surrender to the emotions, surrender to the moment, surrender to the experience. But how? How can you do this in a way that's contained and safe and helpful? So we've heard a lot about mindfulness at this conference, and I'm going to talk more about mindfulness, the way we practice it in a clinical setting. So, the simplest definition of mindfulness is just bearing in mind, it's not forgetting, as Alan Wallace said. The definition we use is paying attention in the present moment with a certain attitude, which is non-judgmental awareness. So it's a simple definition. It's simple, being in the present moment, but it is by no means easy. So if you think about where your mind often is, and I'm sure many of you have done this, you might find it's in the past. And if you're dealing with a difficult illness, you might be asking yourself, why me? Or saying, if only this or if only that. Having regrets, being angry, getting depressed. Or maybe your mind's racing in the future, and this happens a lot for people I work with. Oh my God, what's going to happen now? What's my future going to look like? What about my kids? What about my treatment? What if I don't make it? So there's worry and stress there. However, in the present moment, things are largely okay. Because if you can be in the present, all the depression and anger from the past and the worry of the future just falls away. But it's not easy to do. Our minds are conditioned otherwise. So when we talk about mindfulness, we break it into these sort of 3 core elements. So stepping back, there's always the intention. Why do we want to be mindful? Why do we want to practice this? And sometimes in clinical interventions, intention gets stripped away, but I believe it's really important. And there can be many levels of intention. It can be very simple. I just want to learn to be in the moment and accept what is. That's a great intention. Other people come, and Alan Wallace again talked about this with specific, I want to learn to reduce my stress, I want to sleep better. And that's fine. If you come with that intention, that's probably the outcome you'll achieve. Other people find that it's a time of transition, of flux, of reprioritizing in their lives when they're diagnosed with this illness. And they want to change the way they live their lives on a more fundamental level. They want to find more meaning and purpose in life. And if that's what they're after, maybe that's what they'll find. So your intention for practice, but then you have to hold it loosely, because it really is about letting go and non-striving. And then attention, of course, we have to tend to what's happening in the present moment. And paying attention is not so easy. Our minds are trained to wander. There's all the distractions. So attention is a skill that we're developing through the course of this practice. And then there's the attitude that we do it with. Super important. It's easy actually to be very harsh and critical, and I can't meditate. My mind's all over the place. I'm doing it all wrong. I'm a failure. Okay, that is not the kind of attitude that's helpful in this context. So we need to be kind. We need to be open. We need to be curious about this. So how do we train people in learning how to develop this quality of mindfulness? I'm sure many of you are familiar with mindfulness-based interventions. And the most famous of them is MBSR, which is Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, developed by John Kabat-Zinn, a lovely man at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center back in 1979. He started the program. And he was brilliant in combining what was known about stress management from the West with principles of meditation from the East. And he had studied in the East and had a personal practice and experience. And he brought these together in a secularized kind of way in a package that was easily accessible for people. And so all the people who were falling through the cracks in the hospital, people with chronic pain, people with anxiety, people who just couldn't be helped by conventional treatments, they were sent down the hallway, it was actually in the basement, to see John, and he helped them learn to practice mindfulness. And it was amazingly successful. And to this day, that same program is running. They've trained tens of thousands of people. And mindfulness-based stress reduction programs have been adopted around the world. There's many here in Australia, and been applied to all sorts of different conditions. One adaptation that's very well known is MBCT, that's mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And Zindel Siegel in Canada, Mark Williams, John Teasdale in the UK studied depression, and they're experts in cognitive behavior therapy for depression. Well, they applied it to help people who'd been depressed but were now in remission, but were at risk for relapses, and that's the real problem with depression. And so they combined mindfulness practices with cognitive therapy principles, came up with this new intervention, trained people who were relapsed or depressives in remission, and were able to half the rate of relapse that was happening in a control group. So that's MBCT, and that's been applied to a wide range of conditions since then as well. Our adaptation is called Mindfulness-Based Cancer Recovery, MBCR. And it's really a minor adaptation of MBSR that takes into account some of the unique challenges of going through life-threatening illness, like having to deal with the existential issues around mortality, death, and dying, around uncertainty and loss of control. So all of these are 8-week group programs, and the way they work, a little plug for my workshop tomorrow. If you want to know more about the way they work, you can come tomorrow afternoon and find out. But essentially, it's training in mindfulness through practice of meditation, mindfulness meditation. And we also have quite a large emphasis on yoga or mindful movement as well. So we use a wide range of different techniques or practices of meditation, beginning with a body scan, which is just a lying down sensory awareness type of a practice where you bring your attention, say, to your toes and slowly move all the way up to your head. You're just learning to train your attention to where you'd like it to be, constantly returning when it drifts away. Mindfulness of breath in the sitting practice is sort of the core practice of the program. We also do walking meditation. We train people in loving kindness practice. We do some visualization and imagery. So it's a bit of a grab bag of different approaches. And the objective is that by the end of the 8-week program, people will be able to develop their own practice. We include the gentle movement as well, and really feel that the emphasis on the body is important, that connection of learning to tune into the body and be aware of what the body is telling you. For these people, many feel betrayed by the body, and they're not friends anymore, and the body's changed through surgery, through treatments, weight loss or weight gain symptoms. So it's a way of befriending, again, the physical element of the body and the mind. So that's a key element of our program as well. So once we sort of got this underway, how do we come to sort of where we think we might be going? The key is practice. So in our programs, people commit to 45 minutes of practice a day, 30 minutes of meditation, 15 minutes of mindful movement or yoga. We give them CDs to help them along. And it's a challenge, right? We say to people, the stress reduction can be really stressful, right? You know, here I am asking you to find another 45 minutes every day. We're all busy. We have, and people do find it difficult. And if you've ever tried to start a regular meditation practice, you've probably felt resistance as well. Don't feel like it. We talked about that yesterday, right? Doesn't matter if you feel like it, you just do it. And John Kabat-Zinn always says that I don't care how much you've read, I don't care what you say, is your ass on the cushion? So that's what we say to people, and it takes 2 to 3 weeks until they've all got their behinds on their cushions. They're doing it whether they want to or not. And we encourage them to think of it like an experiment, just for 8 weeks. If I don't do anything else in my day, this is what I'm going to do. So they practice some more. They do it every day. And you practice some more. And this is, people jokingly say sometimes, but it's only an 8-week program, what do you expect from me? I say, well, it's the start of the rest of your life, right? People have been working on this. There's monks and nuns spending, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 hours in caves, investigating their mind. It's just the tip of the iceberg. So what happens after all this practice? So we began in 1997, our program, and our first study was in 1998. And since that time, we and many other research groups have investigated the effects of this type of training in people with cancer. And there's been many studies in other illnesses as well. And so we've done things like give people questionnaires before and after the program. We've done interviews with long-time meditators. And we use comparison groups as well for better controls. So what kind of things do we find? So first of all, the psychological symptomatology goes down very significantly. So we see less anxiety. We see less mood disturbance, things like anger, depression. And as well, there is less of that rumination about the past and worry about the future. The first study we did, we were shocked, actually. It was a randomized controlled trial with a wait list. So we were comparing people who did the group to a similar group of patients who were randomly assigned to do it later. So they had no intervention. And we found that in the people who did the program, there was a 65% reduction in mood disturbance, anger, anxiety, depression, the whole thing. 65%, just over 8 weeks. And there was only like a 5% or something reduction in the control group. It also had the same passage of time. It was a really big effect. We were like, wow, you know, this is more than we've seen in a lot of other support groups. Maybe we're onto something. And later on, we realized that it's through decreasing these processes of rumination and worry that there seems to be benefit. Less stress. So we measure stress in a whole bunch of different ways. You know, and we've looked at physiological measures of stress, so there's less muscle tension, there's less cardiopulmonary arousal, there's less of the sort of sweating and anxiety. There's also fewer psychological symptoms of stress, like irritability and lashing out, and the cognitive symptoms like forgetfulness, feeling overwhelmed. All those things seem to go down. Sleep disorders are a huge problem for people with cancer and other medical illnesses. We did a study where we took people who had diagnosed insomnia, and we actually compared MBCR, mindfulness-based cancer recovery, to the gold standard treatment, which is cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia. This is the gold standard, the best, better than medication treatment for insomnia. Well, the mindfulness program wasn't as good immediately after the program, but 3 months later, the people who trained in the mindfulness had just as much improvement in sleep as the people in CBT for insomnia. And they had other benefits around the stress and the anxiety reduction. And along with that comes less fatigue. Chronic fatigue is a huge problem for cancer patients as well. So it seems that something about the program is helping them feel more energized. So we talked about this idea of real happiness, this eudaimonic well-being. And we actually have tapped into that a bit as well with patients. There's questionnaires that measure things that are called benefit finding or post-traumatic growth or spirituality. And on those questionnaires, people report having a greater sense of meaning and connection, a greater purpose in life. We've done interview studies with graduates of our program. So we have a drop-in group after people have done the 8 weeks. There's a weekly drop-in they can come to and practice anytime they like. We interviewed people who'd been in that drop-in group for a number of years. And they talked a lot about personal transformation and personal growth and a sense of spirituality. We don't talk about spirituality at all. It's very secular. Yet it sneaks in when you sit down and do the meditation practices. And this was something that was very important to people in the group. We're also interested in looking at some of the biomarkers. So, for example, we know that people who've been treated with cancer are at high risk for heart disease because of the cardiotoxicity of some of the treatments. So we looked at blood pressure over the course of the program, and surprisingly, well, not necessarily surprisingly, but we were the first ones to show that for people who had even slightly elevated blood pressure at the beginning, over the course of the weeks, it decreased until they were in the healthy range of systolic blood pressure. We have also taken blood samples to measure what's happening with immune functioning, so we look at cytokines, which are markers of inflammation in the body, and have showed changes in those pre to post program, as well as over an entire year of follow-up. What we saw was decreases in some of the inflammatory markers, which are generally associated with poorer disease states or poorer outcomes. We also take saliva samples and we look at stress hormones. So we look at salivary cortisol. And there's a nice healthy pattern of cortisol secretion throughout the day that you see in healthy people, but these patterns are interrupted sometimes in people with disease. So what we found is that, again, pre to post intervention in the cancer patients who had taken the program, their profiles begin to look more like healthy people. There's more diurnal variation, which is what you want. Lately, we've also looked at blood samples for markers of cell aging, which is called telomere length. So there's telomerase, which is an enzyme that's related to telomere length, and then the actual length of the telomeres are just at the very ends of the chromosomes. And they seem to be important in aging and disease. So as you get older, your telomeres get shorter. Just a gradual process that's related with cell aging and aging of organisms. So what we showed for the very first time is that a short intervention, this 8-week program, could actually maintain telomere length, whereas people in a control condition, their telomeres got a little bit shorter over that same period of time, so they sort of continued the aging, whereas this type of intervention seemed to just sort of forestall it to some extent. Now, we don't know the meaning of these kinds of markers. You know, animal research shows that some of them are good things for better outcomes, but we haven't linked any of these in humans to actual survival from cancer. So it's provocative, but we don't really know what it means yet in terms of disease progression and outcomes. But essentially, I think what's the most important outcome is a sense of freedom. So remember that first slide I showed with the clutching hand of death hovering over the poor, terrified person? There's a freedom from that. It's like, yes, our time is limited, but when we learn to live more mindfully in the moment, time is also infinite. And people begin to reprioritize what's important in life. So the transformation I'm talking about is from fear to a sense of peacefulness, a sense of ease, a sense of calm. And from sadness to meaning in life, and joy, and purpose. And really focusing not so much on the quantity of life, because again, no one ever knows when their day is up. But it doesn't really matter if you have good quality of life, when all your moments are meaningful moments. And that's really what we strive for everyone to reach that point. So I've taken you on a bit of a journey here. I've reinforced the fact that you are not going to live forever. I hope no one's too surprised by that. But is there a way to transform your moments so that no matter how much time you have, it's meaningful time, and there's a sense of ease and freedom and tranquility and the preciousness of life, no matter how much we have. And don't ever forget that. You know, Mary Oliver has this wonderful quote. It's, how do you want to spend your one wild and precious life? So don't ever forget that, and enjoy the rest of your life.
By the time we're 60, more than 90% of us will have known someone close to us who has suffered from some sort of a neurological disorder.
You all know you're not going to live forever. There's only one way into this life and one way out.
I cannot prove to you anymore that anything is possible.
Talk about the marvelous thing that we now understand about our brains.
It gets so much better.